Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. We're back on the unintended consequences chain, and actually this is proving to be kind of fun. This time I want to talk about something that you don't know a thing about, and that's football.
That's the strange-looking ball.
Why
in God's name do they have a ball shaped like that?
Because that's what it is. Why do you ask idiotic
that's
questions?
That's what it is. What kind of answer is that?
God, it's the right answer. A football is a football. If you want to use a softball, then you'd be playing softball. But anyway, if you pay attention to things, you'll see old-timey pictures of football players in leather helmets.
Yeah, the leather helmet.
And, prior to that, no helmets. So this was a step in the right direction.
And even the leather ones, if I'm recalling the pictures correctly, there's no whatever that plastic guard is over the front.
A face mask is what that's called. And there was a time when, even more dangerously in hockey, there were no face masks.
Oh, wow.
Imagine a puck come whistling at you 105 miles an hour, and the only thing between it and your teeth is nothing. But let's stick with football. You might recall our president, Gerald Ford, played football at Yale. There are pictures of Gerald Ford with his leather helmet on, right?
Yeah.
And the jokes kind of write themselves because anybody who remembers Gerald Ford remembers him falling down staircases coming out of Air Force One. The joke at the time was maybe he should have worn a bigger helmet when he played football. That's a little unfair, but it sure was funny. But we only got to the point we're at now over a long period of time, decades, and a lot of injuries. So we started adding things to the helmet. First, we added a face mask, and we made the helmet plastic, and then we put a lot of padding on the underside of the plastic. And before you know it, you're wearing something that is actually damn near crush-proof.
And just to underline here, all of this evolution, I'm assuming, was not government intervention, but it was NFL regulation. If you're going to play, you've got to have these things.
Yeah.
So it's somebody telling you, you've got to do this.
And there's a college angle here too, right? The NCAA has its rules over time. But here's where it gets weird, because when you got to the point where it became nearly impervious to any kind of missile coming towards it, more missiles started coming towards it. The quality of the helmet dictated a new kind of play on the part of the players. And what did they do? They started aiming right at each other's heads.
Huh.
You're going to hit a man in the chest where he's got all kinds of padding there too, or you're going to take a shot at his head. Concussions are going to start happening a lot. Now, if you go back and you look at how people played the game with the leather helmets or prior to helmets, headshots were almost unheard of because everybody knew that you could really hurt someone with that.
Well, I imagine it goes the other direction as well. If I'm wearing a lighter helmet, I'm going to be less apt to put my head in harm's way.
Yeah, the safer we made people, the more dangerous it became. And that led to way more injuries than had ever been the case before.
So the net result here is we attempt to make the game safer by having safer equipment, and it actually becomes more dangerous because people alter their behavior.
And you can track the rule changes over the years to start dealing with the fallout of this. A couple of years ago, it became illegal to hit a quarterback in the head. If you even touch him, the flag comes out, it's 15 yards. You cannot touch a quarterback's head. The other players, on the other hand, well, you can have a go at some of their heads, but not all, and under some conditions, but not all. And you see that the rule-making bodies are trying to keep the game as something that we would all understand to be football. And if you take all the hitting out, it's no longer football. They want to take the egregious hitting out while maintaining the hitting that's less so, but it's really hard to draw that line. And then what has to happen? A bunch of players have to internalize what that rule means and how their behavior has to change. And that's a long roll, right? Because these guys have been playing football since they were 10, and the rules have been the same since then. And all of a sudden they got to change. And what do you always see that first year after a new safety rule goes in? Everybody's guilty of it all the time. Nobody wants that version of football. And you hear people saying things like, the referees should just let them play. That wasn't an egregious hit. But the minute you have a rule, people adapt to the rule. When that happens, another rule comes and people adapt to that. And before you know it, there's just a bunch of people doing the most dangerous thing they can do under the circumstances. And people say, well, how did we end up here? And we ended up here because we didn't take into account unintended consequences.
Right.
When we went to real helmets from the leather helmets, well, the unintended consequences, now you could hit a man in the head and not hurt him. And that got so bad that they did actually, in fact, start hurting each other. Mm-hmm. And there are, a number of high-profile paralysis cases that occurred because of these things. You can't say we're making a mountain out of a molehill. Grown men can't walk because of some of these rules.
It seems to be the case that people have some level of risk, injury they're willing to live with. And if you make things safer, they'll adapt their behavior in one direction. If you go the other direction and make it less safe, if we had a rule that said nobody can wear any padding or helmet at all, their behavior would move in the other direction and probably end up right back at whatever that level of comfort is.
And there's already a way that we can check in on that, because there's this thing, Australian rules football, that, like all things Australian, is basically a completely lawless activity. It's people doing as much damage as they possibly can to each other without any benefit of padding of any kind. So, tune into that and take a look at their behavior, because what doesn't happen all that often? Headshots. Nobody's wearing a helmet. You're not going to do that, because the minute you do it, the entire rest of the other team will come looking for you.
Yeah.
There is justice to be meted out here. And that's just the reality of it. The unintended consequences matter a lot here. And now what is it in the NFL? Guys are putting in shields underneath the front mask of the helmet. They make them dark like sunglasses, and nobody can see their faces. And is that something we should allow? And it seems that when you're dealing with whether somebody can wear a modified pair of sunglasses, you've probably gone too far. And on that happy note, this is the last time you and I will ever talk about football.
Thank God.
On this podcast.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. If you'd like to support Words and Numbers, make your way over to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers, where you can contribute to our podcast-making habits. If you'd like to schedule us to come speak at your event, be it corporate or educational, or have James officiate at your wedding, send us an email at wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
This week, we're going to return to an old chestnut. As I understand it, the CBO has released a bunch of numbers.
I think the last time we did an actual episode on the Congressional Budget Office was in our first year of the podcast, so it would have been 4 years ago at this point.
It's weird that we let 3 or 4 years go in between these two things.
Well, what's interesting here is that we came to a conclusion that we'll get to here in a moment when we looked at this 4 years ago. And enough time has gone by, we have a lot more data now, and we can say something about whether our conclusions earlier were misplaced or whether they were right on.
I have a very obvious question here. Who's more right, us or the CBO?
Or the CBO, right. Here's the thing, the Congressional Budget Office, this is the organization that's charged with making economic and fiscal forecasts, budget forecasts for the federal government. They forecast a number of things, but the major things we want to look at are tax revenues, that's total federal tax revenues, all sources combined, federal outlays, that's all federal spending, everything that federal government spends money on, GDP, and debt. The CBO produces these forecasts for the current year and each of the subsequent 10 years. So every year, the CBO has given us 11 years worth of forecasts, current year and each of the next 10 years. If you put that all together, that's a total of over 200 forecasts that the CBO has made since 1997, and we've got what actually happened. We can compare what CBO forecasted to what actually transpired. The numbers here are along the lines of what we found 4 years ago, and that is the CBO's estimates are rosy in both directions. They tend to overpredict tax revenues and underpredict government spending. The net result, of course, being that we end up with much higher debt than what the CBO anticipates. To give you some numbers, I'm going to talk here about the 10-year out number, because forecasting next year is pretty easy. Next year generally looks like the current year, unless you have something like COVID come along, which is not forecastable. So let's talk about the 10-year out forecasts. When CBO forecasts 10 years out tax revenues, on average, it's 27% too high. That's a decent chunk.
I could swear that that was exactly the number we came up with years ago when we first did this.
Yeah, that's ballpark what we came up with 4 years ago. So it's about the same. I can say a little bit more this time because someone can say rightly so that, well, maybe some years their forecast is way high and other years it's less high. what does that look like? Well, what it looks like is the following. On average, CBO is 27% too high when forecasting tax revenues, and 95% of the time, they're between 18% and 36% too high. So even in a good case scenario, they're still 18% too high.
For crying out loud, if you're wrong like this year in, year out, at some point, don't we have to say something crazy like, okay, you're fired?
Right. Well, no, see, that's the interesting thing, because politicians like it that CBO errs in this direction. In fact, the blame here isn't on CBO, it's on the politicians. By law, CBO must incorporate whatever assumptions the politicians give them, no matter how outlandish. And so you have something like, I recall back during the housing bubble when Barack Obama was in his first or his second year of his presidency, and I looked at CBO forecasts for economic growth over the subsequent decade. And remember, this is like 2009, 2010 we're talking, height of this housing crash recession. And the CBO forecasted that the economy would grow at dot-com era levels for each of the next 10 years. That was so outlandish.
Why would anybody say such a thing?
Well, because some politician somewhere said, okay, I want you, CBO, to assume that the economy grows at this breakneck pace. Of course, it was ridiculous. But what happens? You get forecasts from the CBO that the politicians can now point to. And they can say things like, well, my economic policy is going to generate X trillion dollars of additional revenue over the next decade. Well, what they're quoting are the CBO figures, but the CBO figures are skewed by the assumptions that the politicians foist upon the CBO. And so you got this problem here of, on average, their forecasts for tax revenues are 27% too high.
Well, look, man, if we were doing that in either of our homes, if that's the way we were managing our home budgets, we'd all get thrown out of our houses before too long.
Right. Imagine if consistently, year in, year out, you were forecasting that your household income was going to be 27% higher than it actually ends up becoming.
You know what, Ed? I would love that, because that would be fantastic. So I do hereby simply declare it. And that's the problem that's getting made at the governmental level. They're just deciding to work with assumptions they all know are false.
They are. And this is where the economic problem becomes a political problem, because then they'll hold these numbers out to the voters and they'll say things like, elect me and my plan has all these revenues coming in the future, and people cheer and say, yeah, let's vote for that guy. He's fiscally prudent. But the numbers are complete nonsense. And this is just in one direction. We're talking about federal revenues. Let's talk about federal spending.
Well, hang on a second. It's very telling that the error on the side of revenues is always to the favorable side.
Yeah, it is.
They never think, oh my God, we're going to have 27% less this year than next.
Right.
That never comes up. So, they're cooking the books right there.
Well,
if it was just a random error, it would be random all over the place, not just to the good.
Just to back off a little bit, I'm not saying that every single CBO forecast for tax revenue is too high. In fact, they do occasionally forecast too low. But here's the thing. Of the 209 forecasts that we can evaluate from the CBO, forecasts of tax revenue, they forecast too low only 40 times. They forecast too high 169 times.
I think the numbers have spoken.
Yeah. Even if you average the lows and the highs, you're still at 27% too high when they're forecasting 10 years out. Now, as if that isn't bad enough, when it comes to forecasting federal spending 10 years out, on average, they're 10% too low. So they're both forecasting too much revenue and too little expenses.
Isn't that astonishing?
And you might say, well, 10%, that's not too bad. But remember, we're talking about like $4 trillion budgets here. 10% is going on $500 billion. That's a decent amount of change.
We should expect this, I guess, because this is just what governments do. But every time I hear the evidence, I'm horrified by it.
Yeah, I'm looking at the numbers, I'm horrified by it. And here's where everything ends up. If you are consistently over-forecasting your revenues and you're under-forecasting your costs, that means that you're going to be underestimating the future deficits, and you're going to be, in turn, underestimating future debt.
Which then allows politicians to say, well, it's not going to be that bad. Let's spend more.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. They'll point to these 10-year out projections and say, life is going to be good, so we can spend more.
On average, I think we can conclude that things get better over time. They just don't get better over time to the degree that the politicians want them to.
So let's look at forecasting what's called the gross federal debt. That's all of the federal debt combined, what the federal government owes to Americans plus what it owes to the Social Security Trust Fund and government pensions, whole thing, the whole ball of wax, total amount of money the federal government owes. The CBO, when it forecasts that number 10 years out, it is on average almost 40% too low. And let me put that in perspective. As of their last forecast, which was July of 2021, so roughly 6 months ago, maybe going on 9 months ago, the CBO forecasted that debt for 2031 would be $41 trillion. Now, that's breathtaking. The debt right now is $30 trillion, $41 trillion in 10 years. If CBO is off in that forecast as much as they have been off in their other forecasts of the debt 10 years out, we'll actually be looking at $65 trillion, a $65 trillion debt by 2031.
And again, as we always say, that's the stated debt.
It's ignoring unfunded obligations, which who knows what those are, other than they're gargantuan even beyond this. And the deficit 10 years from now is going to be about the size of federal revenues today.
Unbelievable.
The numbers really start to get disturbing. Now, someone who would listen to these numbers and say this can't possibly be right, I refer you to what happened a decade ago. A decade ago, the CBO projected that the deficit this year, 2022, would be $340 billion. 10 years ago, they projected the deficit today would be $340 billion. Correct answer? $1.2 trillion.
Well, they were close.
They were like 1/3 of what the actual number ended up being.
Come on, Ant, what do you expect? There's no way we can predict these things accurately. We only have to predict them such that people act on what we want them to act on the moment that we predict it. This is classic liar problems, right? What do? They lie so you can behave in a certain way. How do they lie? Forward looking. They say things will be X, knowing good and well things are not going to be X. And yet, all they need to do is say it in such a way that people say, okay, that's going to be difficult, but sure, we can do that.
The lesson here is keep these numbers in mind when you hear politicians say things like, well, we can afford to forgive student loans because in forgiving student loans, it's going to make more spending available for young people. That's going to stimulate the economy and create more tax revenues. And then politicians will use these words. They'll say, my plan pays for itself. And where are those numbers coming from? They're coming from things like this.
That's always great. You know what pays for itself in Washington, D.C.? Nothing.
Yeah, that's about right.
They're saying that we're going to continue to tax you and you'll pay for it. And that's how it will pay for itself.
So here we are. By my calculations, we'll actually be looking at a federal debt of $65 trillion 10 years from now. And again, that's just taking CBO's existing forecasts and adjusting them for CBO's past errors. $65 trillion is what we'll probably be looking at. So let's think about, with that much debt, what's our annual interest expense? Well, the federal government pays right now 2.5% interest on its debt. So 2.5% interest on a $65 trillion debt, and you're at an interest expense of above $1.5 trillion. So
my God,
hang on a second, because at that magnitude, 10 years from now, the interest expense on the debt becomes the second biggest line item in the budget after Social Security.
And we say now that you literally cannot balance the budget without dealing with Social Security. And we're just going to kick that down the road until Social Security and interest on the debt add up to the gargantuan things that you have no choice but to deal with.
Right. You're making the same problem out of the interest expense that the Social Security is currently.
Unbelievable.
Oh, and by the way, because people say things like, well, if we got rid of defense spending, we wouldn't have this problem. Same numbers here. 10 years from now, we end up with $65 trillion debt at current interest rates. The interest expense is $1.6 trillion a year. That is twice the size of CBO's projection of the defense budget.
Right now, if we just eliminated the Defense Department, we still couldn't balance the budget.
Oh, yeah, that's correct. Our budget deficit now is like over $1 trillion, and Defense Department budget is like $750 billion, something like that, 700.
When I say this in front of a room full of human beings, I can actually hear their eyelids closing.
Right.
Nobody can get their head around this, but it is literally true that if we cut every penny of defense spending, the budget would not be balanced.
Yeah.
You have to deal with Social Security. There is no other way.
And it's interesting you say that, because as I'm delving into these numbers and performing what-if scenarios with the interest and Social Security and so forth, I'm kind of coming to the conclusion that the government's going to have no choice but to retrench Social Security. It's going to have to cut it back. Well, there is another alternative that I don't think is on the table. I would have given it a higher priority in the past, but I'm changing my mind now, and that is simply print the money. I think it's become very clear that printing money gives us inflation that people are not happy about. That's the alternatives. You got those two things, either cut back Social Security or print money to pay for it.
It'll be both.
Possibly a mix, but according to the Social Security Board of Trustees, we would have to cut Social Security by around 25%, or alternatively raise payroll taxes by more than 25% to make Social Security solvent. And neither one of those things is palatable.
We've been saying this for a long time. Here we are, as predicted. We're at a place where there are now only bad options. There's no good option here. There's nothing that we could say, all right, well, we could take care of that thusly.
And if you want to use a household as an example, we've been throwing a decades-long party, and we've been putting on the credit card. And as the credit card bill came due, we've opened up new credit card lines of credit to use the new credit cards to pay for the old credit cards. You keep on doing that up to a point until the lender says, that's enough, I'm not lending you anymore. Or in the case of the United States, we borrowed so much, there's not many people left we can go to borrow more.
What you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that almost everything we predicted 4 years ago has come to pass, and almost nothing the CBO predicted 4 years ago has anything to do with reality.
I think if there's good news here in terms of the forecasting, it's that although CBO's forecasts are biased, they tend to be consistently biased. As long as you know what that bias is, you can adjust them and get a decent idea of what's actually going to be happening.
And that doesn't soothe the soul at all.
There's one piece of the puzzle I've left out, and that is all of this stuff I'm talking about, the interest on the debt and so forth. It was assuming that the government pays 2.5% interest. And right now we've got the Fed making lots of serious noise about raising interest rates to fight the inflation. And if they do that and continue to do that, all of a sudden the federal government's not paying 2.5% interest, it's paying 3.5% interest, which adds another $1 trillion to the annual interest expense.
As is the case with all middle-aged men, I keep an eye on the 30-year fixed mortgage rates.
Right.
And they have functionally doubled in the last couple of months.
That's kind of interesting, James, because it brings us back to something you and I said 4 years ago. And that is that we're going to reach a point where the Federal Reserve is forced to make a choice between doing what's good for the federal government and doing what's good for the American people. And what's good for the federal government is low interest rates because it keeps the interest expense low. What's good for the American people is low inflation. But those two things are contradictory at the moment, because to get the low inflation, you got to cut back on the money supply. But you cut back on the money supply, you get high interest rates. And so the Federal Reserve's in this very weird place where it has to decide who it's going to serve.
It's whack-a-mole, and it's going to be whack-a-mole for a while.
Let me go back to Social Security, because I think as bad as all these numbers look, I get the sense, and I'm going to tread lightly here because I haven't done serious calculations, but I've done enough calculations. They all seem to be pointing in the same direction. And that direction is, if we can significantly cut back Social Security, we might be able to get all of this financial problem under control. And by significantly cut back on Social Security, what I mean is get maybe, what am I talking, a third to a half of the people who are on the Social Security system off.
Never going to happen.
Well, I don't know, because I can see politicians making an argument that there's a large swath of Americans, roughly a third, maybe up to a half of them, who have employer-supported pensions or retirement funds, IRAs, 401ks, things like that, such that they don't need Social Security.
You are involving yourself with dangerous talk right now.
Yeah, well, but I don't know any other way out. If the politicians can find a way to make an argument that people who have enough private retirement should not be pulling Social Security benefits. I don't want to say they solve this problem, but it moves from being an unmanageable problem to a manageable problem.
Oh, come on, man. You know what will happen then.
Yeah, but that's the thing. Right. Go ahead. You know exactly what's going to happen.
Of course, everybody knows exactly what's going to happen. They'll pull exactly the same after they turn this into a manageable problem, and then it will once again become, over time, an unmanageable problem.
Right. They do this, it becomes a manageable problem, everybody breathes a sigh of relief, and then all of a sudden one of them says, hey, wait, now we can afford to forgive student loans. And we're right back where we started.
Now we can really get the party started.
Right.
Good God.
But the bottom line here is it's a very simple thing, that the federal government has been living beyond its means for decades. And you get the same effect. Yes, the federal government is not a household, but the laws of mathematics, the laws of finance work the same. You're going to get the same outcome as if you had a household and you just lived off of your credit card for so long that now there's no way you can pay this back. You can't even afford to make the minimum monthly payments. Forget about paying it back.
But because you're the government, well, whatever you say is what's going to happen.
Right. Because you're the government, you can print money, which if you or I tried, we go to jail for that.
Yeah, no, I remember looking into that, and counterfeiting
no bad idea.
is really not to be accomplished, right? I was pretty sure I could do a good job of it too, but really it's not worth the risk. I just want to know where this all leaves us, because it seems that no matter which way I fix my gaze, I'm looking at things that are absolutely untenable, things that will never happen. We're just talking in the middle of a tornado here.
Yeah, we are.
There's nothing we can say that will make any difference whatsoever. The tornado is going to carve out whatever it's going to carve out.
In a weird way, what fuels a tornado are the voters themselves.
That's right.
The answer to this problem is voters have to stop asking for stuff, period.
There was a time when such a thing would have been viewed with such skepticism. That time is long past. What do you get? You get two parties keep on offering the moon and the stars to the people. Well, sooner or later, that's going to come back to haunt you. And here's the thing. We've got this mammoth deficit, which leads to a gargantuan debt, and yet we don't get the things that were promised even so.
Right.
We spend all kinds of money, but it's not like we're living in nirvana here. We're still living in a constrained universe. There's only so much politicians can do.
Well, yeah, and take an example. You and I talked a few episodes back about the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, there you go.
And we were promised that the cost of our insurance would decline. It didn't. We were promised that everybody would be insured. They aren't. Are things better? You might argue around the edges. Things are better now than they were then. In other ways, they're worse. But the fact is, we were promised a bill of goods that never arrived in exchange for this massive government program.
It gets worse with each passing year because it gets more Byzantine. In the end, even the simplest of the promises turned out to be lies. We were not able to keep our doctors.
Right.
Any number of
that
us.
one sticks in your craw.
It does. The minute the ink was dry on this piece of legislation, I lost a doctor, and it took me over a year to find another one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because nobody would take a new patient. That was never even considered by the people who put that bill together. And now, every day, I see Bernie Sanders, and he uses a word that is just an indicator from a mile away. Every time Bernie Sanders says must, brace yourself, because here it comes. And he's been saying lately that we must fix healthcare. I thought he was one of the people who fixed healthcare.
Yeah, didn't we fix it?
Apparently, all that effort that Bernie went to was for naught, because now we have to do something else. He never says what.
And that's the interesting thing, because you have each generation comes along and they see a problem. Let's take healthcare as an example. They see the problem with healthcare and they say, well, the government should do something to fix this. And so we do something. And a couple decades go by and the next generation comes along and things haven't been fixed. And they look and they say, hey, the government should do something to fix this. And we do something else. And we do this decade after decade after decade. And the problem is nobody stops and asks the question, could we make things better here by asking the government to stop doing things? Somehow the answer is always for the government to do more, never for the government to do less.
No, and it makes me want to scream from the rooftops, don't just do something, stand there.
And that's not to say that there's no role for government here at all. However, there are lots of instances that we can look at in which the government would actually make things better if it stopped doing something rather than doing something new.
And on that happy note, Ant, that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week when we talk about something, I don't know, equally depressing, more depressing. We'll have to see how the week goes. Until then, you can follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. As always, you can join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and you can
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
But always remember, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should.
No, you definitely should.
Ant, I'll catch you next week. Just be quiet. Let it go. I'll talk to you next week.
See you next week, James.